Hello, I'm Lawrence and I'm on a quest to uncover all of the memos that Britain and America lost in the pond, and one of those memos pertains to words, specifically English words that Americans don't seem to use very often. Now, if you're subscribed to this channel, you'll know that a few weeks ago I did a video looking at 8 such words. And if you're not subscribed to this channel, I'm going to give you 3 seconds to amend this grave error. Thanks. Now, a quick word of warning before we get underway. I have just had my booster shot, so I feel like arse. So this video might go down in history for all the wrong reasons. Anyway, this is the second entry in the series looking at words that I was surprised to find America doesn't use. Here are 8 more of them. You know, I think it's common knowledge that words that we use to describe things like food or just sort of everyday activities are going to be different on either side of the pond, right? There's a big ocean in the way, and those things were used at different times in different ways, and the memos just got lost. And then amongst it all, there are words like amongst, which Americans don't really use. And I used to use it all the time, I think. At least when there was a situation that made me feel obliged to use it, obligated. And it seems to be whenever you talk to Americans about this sort of thing, they view the word amongst as sort of unnecessarily consonant-laden. I swear there are better ways to describe things. But in America, they tend to use the word among. And you know what? This could almost go in my list of American English words that I've started using since moving to the United States. It's just that we do also use the word among in Britain, so it wouldn't technically be considered an American English word, I don't think. The next one is bits and bobs. Americans don't use that term, but if you know anything about British terminology, you'll know that we have a little bit of an obsession with the name Bob. Come to that, we're not altogether afraid of using the word bits, but partly for reasons that would get me demonetised. But in Britain, when we use the phrase bits and bobs, we just mean stuff. There's bits and bobs lying around, like this coffee cup. How did that get there? Lawrence is dying today, so he needs it to stay awake. Put it this way, it's more or less the same thing as a phrase that both Brits and Americans use, which is odds and ends. I told you we were obsessed with Bob, and a lot of Americans who interact with me like to bring up the phrase, Bob's your uncle. What does it mean, Lawrence? But in an American accent. Well, since the phrase hasn't really caught on in the United States, I'll tell you what I told travel host Rick Steves. Name dropping is bad. Bob's your uncle is just sort of a very British way of saying voila, right? So I'll give you an example. If you become a patron of this channel at patreon.com/lostinthepond, then Bob's your uncle, you'll get access to my secret live streams. At the top of this list, you may remember that I very confidently asserted that it's never surprising when you get food items whose names are different on either side of the pond, unless you get ones that you just didn't know about, which actually is quite frequent. Because yes, I knew about fries versus chips or chips versus crisps, but I was surprised to learn that Americans don't use the word cornflour, and I can already hear those that aren't culinarily inclined asking, what is cornflour, Lawrence? Cornflour is a thickening agent that you use, right? That's essentially flour that's made from corn. And I can already hear you at home as an American going, oh, he means cornstarch, because that's what they call it in America. And actually, it seems like there's quite a lot of terminology differences when it comes to your flours and your sugars and all of the other white powders that I can't talk about, that I could almost do an entire really messy video on the subject. And while that wouldn't be easy, this entry quite literally is, because that is the definition of Doddle. A Doddle is something that is easy. So let me give you another example. Making YouTube videos is an absolute doddle when you haven't just had a booster shot. I take that back, it's not easy work. Mum, I work really hard at this job. But with the word being quintessentially British slang, Americans don't really use that word. Instead, Americans might say it's a piece of cake. What else have I heard? Yeah, I can't think of many others. There's probably loads. I should have looked these up beforehand. I have to confess that even though this word is a little bit mean, I feel very sad that I had to leave it behind, because it just sounds so good and it's very cathartic when you use it. So Americans, you might be watching this thinking, Lawrence, you just made up a word. And I promise I didn't. Gomless is a word we use to describe someone who's a little bit unintelligent. And it feels particularly nice to use it in harmless scenarios. So when you're berating your GPS for taking you in the wrong direction. You Gomless fool, I wanted Springfield, Wisconsin, not Springfield, Wisconsin, for those of you that don't don't get that, there are several Springfields in Wisconsin. The only thing about this word is you never hear of anybody being described in the opposite manner. Nobody is ever gormful, because what would it mean to be full of gorm? Probably intelligent. I am gormful. I might use that word in conversation. This was a big surprise, especially since the United States borders Mexico. I just assumed that we all use this phrase in the same way. But my American viewers, and probably my Mexican viewers, are thinking, what is a Mexican wave? Well, it's what we call that sports phenomenon when everybody in the stadium in unison does this and then sits down, and it looks great on TV. It can be complicated when you're at the game and you've got food on your lap, so I'm told. So why do we in Britain call this the Mexican wave? Well, the thing is, most of the rest of the world outside of the Americas hadn't even heard of this phenomenon until 1986. Because like most things in British life, the origin of this word comes back to football, soccer. In 1986, the World Cup took place in Mexico. And for the first time, British eyes were on this phenomenon happening around the stadiums, and we just associated it with the Mexican World Cup. And I believe people still refer to it as the Mexican wave. I've since learned that in North America, not only did they refer to it simply as the wave, but you were all ahead of us because you'd been doing this lunch interfering activity since the 70s. In hindsight, words that often get labelled as quaint by the likes of BuzzFeed do usually turn out to be quintessentially British. But I just assumed that Cheerio, which, if you're familiar with every British film from before the 1970s, simply means goodbye, was used by Brits and Americans alike. And I suppose I had even greater reason to believe that Americans used it based on the fact that you eat a cereal of the same name, just with an S on the end. That would be plural, meaning that if you took one of those O-shaped foodstuffs, then that would be goodbye. That is sad. I'm never eating Cheerios again. Especially in the morning, you want to feel good about yourself. I don't want to be reminded that my breakfast would sooner be on the other side of the country. I've overthought this, haven't I? Anyway, speaking of goodbyes, I've been doing this show now for 7 years, but the time has come to say cheerio. For this episode, what did you think I was going to say? I'm Lawrence Brown. You can follow me on Twitter at LostInThePondUS, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel so that I don't have to. Until the next video, cheerio.